Good evening, everyone. If you are able to see this and hear this, then we are being successful into our first foray into a video Bible class. This evening I am over at the Asheville Road Church as part of their spring and summer series. And so tonight I'll be coming to you by way of video, as well as the next two Wednesday nights, in order to cover the rest of the book of Hosea, and if time permits, possibly even get into the book of Micah, which will be the last of the three prophetic books that we'll be covering this quarter. If you have your Bibles and want to open them to Hosea chapter 4, we'll be looking at the section that covers chapters 4 through 6. This is the second part of the book of Hosea. I assume that if you're watching this right now, you've already had a prayer, and so we'll get right into the Bible study. As we've observed in previous weeks, the book of Hosea is divided basically into two different sections. The first section is chapters 1 through 3, where Hosea outlines his experience as God told him to go and take a wife of prostitution, the three children that are born to them, equating that situation to the circumstances with Israel and the relationship that they had with God. And then in chapters 4 through 13, or 4 through the end of the book, then we have more of an explanation of what is going to happen to Israel and why. And that's where we find ourselves here in chapters 4 through 6. The key word in chapters 4 through 6 is the word adultery. That's a word that we're somewhat familiar with, even though it may not be used a great deal in our modern world, because we like to change words over time to make things sound nicer or cleaner. So you don't hear so much about fornication and or adultery in the modern world. But Hosea begins the text and he says, "Hear the word of the Lord, O children of Israel, for the Lord has a controversy with the inhabitants of the land. There is no faithfulness or steadfast love and no knowledge of God in the land. There is swearing, lying, murder, stealing, committing adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed." And so God's great charge against Israel primarily centers around their sinfulness and their wickedness, their departure from His will, from His law. And that is depicted in these chapters as a type of adultery. Now, the dictionary defines adultery as voluntary intercourse between a married person and a person who is not his or her spouse. Strong, in his dictionary of biblical words, quotes Kohler and Baumgartner in defining the word from the Hebrew as being sexual intercourse with the wife or betrothed of another man. That idea of betrothal we come in contact with, for instance, in Matthew chapter 1, where Joseph was considering what he might do with Mary since she had been found with child. Obviously, if normal things had taken place, then it indicated that she had not been faithful to him, and he had a right to put her away. Adultery carries the idea of intimacy, an intimacy between one person and someone who is not joined legally or spiritually to that particular person. In Matthew 19 and verse 9, Jesus says, "And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality," the old King James says fornication, "and marries another commits adultery." So they have attached another relationship that is not lawful, because the first relationship they had was not ended by sexual infidelity. Here it is used of Israel, who belonged to God, straying from the covenant that they had with God and joining themselves to other gods. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the text. But the lack of intimacy is further shown in chapter 4 and verse 6. Maybe the most familiar passage of all the book of Hosea, "My people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge." But God declares that they were destroyed for a lack of knowledge, and that concept of knowledge is something that's interesting and something that is worth our looking into as well. The Hebrew word hada or yada sometimes is used to indicate intimacy or sexual intercourse. And the text here says there was a lack of and a rejection of, even a forgetting of the law of God, or the relationship that the Israelites had with God through the covenant of the law. And so God would no longer linger with those who chose not to know Him. We see a similar situation in Romans chapter 1, where Paul says that some had left the knowledge of God in verse 21, and then or took no knowledge of God in verse 21, and then in verse 24 he gave them up. Again in verse 26, as they progressed in their behavior and their wickedness, he gave them up again, until finally because of their lack of knowledge, verse 28 tells us, and their rejection of the knowledge of God, he gives them up a third and final time. And so the blame for the condition is squarely placed at the feet of the priests. Here in chapter 4 and verse 4, let no one contend and let none accuse, for with you is my contention, O priest. It's clear that he's talking about the priests as he comes down in verse 8 and says, they feed on the sin of my people, they are greedy for their iniquity. Some people have taken the words of verse 6 where he says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, and verse 7 where it says, the more they increased, and applying that to the people. But in reality, verses 4 and verse 8 identify that he's talking about the priests. The priests had become corrupt because of their pursuit of material things and because of their corruption and not relating to the people the things they needed to know of the will of God. Then the people had become destroyed as well. Isaiah touches on this in Isaiah chapter 30 verses 9 and 10, where he says, for they are rebellious people, lying children, children unwilling to hear the instruction of the Lord, who say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us what is right. Speak to us smooth things, prophesy illusions, according to the ESV. Jeremiah, in Jeremiah chapter 5 and verse 31, speaks of the prophets prophesying falsely and the priests that rule at their direction. My people love to have it so, but what will you do when the end comes? And so the priests and the prophets had become corrupt. They began to tell the people what they wanted to hear, basically because the people said, we don't want to hear what God is saying. We want to hear smooth things. We want to hear easy things. We want to hear things that make us feel good. And that kind of takes us into Paul's instruction to the young man Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, where he tells him to preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, and exhort. The reason being is there was a time coming when those having itching ears would heap to themselves teachers. People who want to hear things that are false, people who want to be told that they may be right with God when in reality they're not. They will find someone who will tell them exactly what they want to hear. And the children of Israel had done this over and over again with their priests and with their prophets. The problem is that ultimately that comes back not only on the people but on the prophet as well, or on the priest as well. And so here are these people who had departed from the law of God. They instructed those who were to teach them the law of God not to tell us the things that we need to hear. And as a result, now they were in the midst of destruction. James warns in James chapter 3 that not many should become teachers, because teachers come under a stricter judgment. In Ezekiel chapter 3 and Ezekiel chapter 33, God places this warning on Ezekiel himself and upon all those who would know of impending doom of his people, of trials and trouble that is coming their way. That if you know these things, you don't blow the trumpet, you don't let the people know, you don't say anything about it, then their blood is going to be required at your hands. On the other hand, if the messenger of God knows of the trouble, knows of the destruction that is coming, warns the people, but the people reject the warning, then their own blood will be required at their own hand. The sins that Israel had repeated continually were the sins of sexual immorality and drunkenness and idolatry, according to verses 10 through 12. They shall eat but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord to cherish whoredom, wine and new wine, which take away the understanding. My people inquire of a piece of wood. That referencing the idol itself, and their walking staff gives them oracles, for a spirit of whoredom has led them astray, and they have left their God to play the whore. And so here the condition of the people as they had departed from God through these means of sexual immorality and drunkenness and idolatry. Verse 14 of chapter 4 should not be understood to say that the women would not receive punishment because of their part in the harlotry and the whoredom that had taken place, where he says, I will not punish your daughters when they play the whore, nor your brides when they commit adultery, for the men themselves go aside with prostitutes and sacrifice with cult prostitutes. I don't think it's to be taken that God's not going to punish the women for their sin, but that the women were in no more jeopardy or certainly no more guilty than the men themselves. You may recall in John chapter 8, when the leaders of the Jews bring the woman who was caught in adultery to Jesus and essentially wanted to know, well, what would you do with her? Jesus stoops down and writes in the sand. We don't know what he wrote in the sand, but I would almost be willing to accept that he may have written something to the likes of, where is the man? If she was caught in the very act, well, then there had to be a man involved. And yet they didn't bring the man, they only brought the woman, which showed a double standard on their part, and thought that the woman should be punished and the man be left alone. As it were, the Israelites were extremely stubborn in their perversions. Now, verse 8 refers to it as iniquity, but it's a Hebrew word which means twisted. They had perverted the law of God. They had perverted their ways. They had perverted their actions. And in verse 16 he says, like a stubborn heifer, Israel is stubborn. Can the Lord now feed them like a lamb in a broad pasture? When I was growing up, we had cows that we raised, and we had a particular heifer, female cow, that she was particularly stubborn, and very often she would get out of the fence no matter what my dad did. We had barbed wire, we had electric fences, everything that was tried. She found a way to get out, and she was very, very stubborn. And so we had to take some different tactics with her, pin her up a little bit differently than we did any of the other cows, because of her stubbornness. And that was true of the Israelites here. They persisted in their wickedness, they persisted in their evil, and that was why they were going to be destroyed. They first turned to idols, according to verse 17, then to drinking, constantly being intoxicated, and then ultimately to their immorality, according to verse 18. And so we need to understand from this that sin is progressive. Sin never stands still. We may think that we have a small sin that's inconsequential, that doesn't harm anybody, but sin very rarely, if ever, stays static. By its very nature, it has to grow. It desires to grow. It wants to become bigger. It wants to flourish in its own wickedness. You may remember in Joshua chapter 7, we mentioned the valley of Achor last week and the week before. But in Joshua chapter 7, when Achan was giving an account of what happened in his sin, he said, I saw the goodly Babylonish garment and the silver and the gold, and I coveted, and then I took. Again, the progressive nature. He first saw it, he desired it in his heart, and then he just picked it up and took it. And that happens very often in our own lives as well. As our desires bring forth lust, and our lust then conceives and it brings forth sin, as James indicates in James chapter 1. And Paul speaks of the same thing in Romans 1, as there's a progressiveness of sin as God gives up on the Gentiles. That leads us then into chapter 5. In chapter 5, emphasis is given greatly upon the judgment itself. Judgment has come upon them, from the king to the priest to the people. Everybody in between is going to be judged because of their wickedness. We're reminded in chapter 5 and verse 1 as he introduces this concept. Hear this, O priest, pay attention, O house of Israel. Give ear, O house of the king, for the judgment is for you. And we're reminded of Amos 4 and verse 12 that we mentioned in an earlier lesson, where Amos says, prepare to meet thy God, O Israel. It's not time really to repent. It's not time to make any changes. That time has already passed. As soon as you turn around, your judgment is upon you. It's going to take place. In verses 3 and 4, he indicates that their sin was so woven into the fabric of who they were. It was almost impossible to separate them from their own sinfulness, or their sinfulness even from them. As a matter of fact, they just could not turn from it. And though they gave a pretense of worship, of honoring God, that he speaks of in verses 5 through 7, he says, you will not find me. Ephraim stumbles in his guilt. Judah also will stumble with them. With their flocks and herds they shall go to seek the Lord and attempt to worship God, make sacrifice. And yet he had withdrawn from them. They had dealt faithlessly with the Lord, and he simply could not be found by the people. And so in verse 10, he goes on to indicate what they should have done was leave the landmarks alone. Very often the people over time, they will forget why they first began down the road that they began. This can be observed in a lot of our higher learning institutions. Schools that once were associated with churches of Christ and with the Restoration movement have long since departed, and some are headed down a pathway of departure even today. And it's because they forget why they were originally instituted, why they were originally built. Just this week I was listening to a podcast that was talking about the fact that churches, even church plants, new churches, they become traditional in their ways of doing things within 3 to 5 years. And one of the reasons why is they become settled into what they have determined they're going to be, and they forget why they initially started. Maybe they started because they wanted to reach out into a new community. Maybe they started because they wanted to be evangelistic in a certain area. They started because they wanted to offer something to a community. But over time, they start focusing on themselves rather than on the community, and so they forget why they originally went there, why they originally started doing what they were doing. And in religion, we do the same thing, and in Bible study, we do the same thing. A few years ago, the rage was the new hermeneutic. We need a new way to study the Bible. The old way just is ineffective. It's not doing what we need it to do. It's causing more division than it is unity, and so we need a new hermeneutic. One writer at the time, and I think he was correct in saying this, he says, we don't need a new hermeneutic or a new gospel for a new age. We need the old Jerusalem gospel for every age. Very often the way to go forward is to go back, to remember our roots, to remember why we're here, to remember what caused us to begin in the first place. You remember the church at Ephesus in Revelation chapter 2, Jesus said they had left their first love. They needed to go back and rekindle that first love. And sometimes in our own lives, we need to do the very same thing. And even when they realized their condition, they sought a remedy somewhere other than God. Verse 13, when Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, then Ephraim went to Assyria and sent to the great king, but he is not able to cure you or heal your wound. Here they were in trouble with God, so we'll go to the king of Assyria. The king of Assyria is not going to be able to remedy their problems and their difficulty. Their difficulty was sin. And so often men will try to seek out other ways to remedy their problems and their issues instead of going to God in prayer, instead of bowing before God in confession. Men will turn to a bottle, to pills, to drugs, to sexual immorality, to any number of things in order to ease themselves instead of turning to God, who truly can heal them and can make their way straight. And then in chapter 6, as we turn to this final chapter of this segment of the book, and the shortest chapter of this 3-chapter section, as it opens up, the people seem to realize that they need the Lord. Look in verse 1. Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us, and he has struck us down, and he will bind us. They even realize that he can heal them. The end of verse 1, and then going into verse 2, after 2 days he will revive us. On the third day he will raise us up that we may live before him. And then in verse 3 they come to the realization of their true need. Let us know. Let us press on to know the Lord. It's getting back to that intimacy, that knowledge of God that draws you in, that draws you closer. And they have an intellectual understanding that this is what they need. This is the path they need to take. This is the way to restoration. But quickly we learn that their devotion is like a morning fog or a morning mist, that as soon as the sun comes out, it goes away. Verse 4, what shall I do with you, O Ephraim? What shall I do with you, O Judah? Your love is like a morning cloud, like the dew that goes early away. Therefore I have hewn them by the prophets, I have slain them by the words of my mouth, and my judgment goes forth as light, for I desire steadfast love, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. Reminded in verse 6 of Samuel's words to Saul. After God had sent Saul to defeat the enemy and to destroy everything, Saul brings back the cattle and the best of the goods of their enemy. And Samuel comes on the scene and he says, wait a minute, what is all this? What's the bleating of sheep? What's this noise that I hear? Oh, well, the people wanted to bring it back and offer it to God. 1 Samuel 15:22, and Samuel reminds him just these words: God desires mercy rather than and not sacrifice. God desires obedience rather than sacrifice, with the words of 1 Samuel 7:15. But Jesus uses this same ideology and the same terminology that Hosea uses here in his confrontation of the Pharisees. The Pharisees were strict in their judgments concerning the law. They were very circumspect in the way that they went about keeping the law. And yet Jesus says, wait a minute, there's something more to this. And God wants you to show mercy. He wants you to extend grace. He wants you to show love even more than He wants you to tithe your mint, your anise, your cumin, to offer sacrifices to Him. You have to realize there are priorities with God. And so then the chapter ends with a stern warning, not to Israel. Again, remember, at this point, Israel's fate is sealed. Their doom is there. And so there's a stern warning, not to Israel, but to Judah. Verse 11, for you also, O Judah, a harvest is appointed when I restore the fortunes of my people. There's much more to be said about what will happen ultimately with Judah, yet Israel was going to serve as a vivid lesson. Here's what happens when you turn your back on God. And Israel ultimately would go away into oblivion, where they would never be heard from as a nation again. Judah, however, was going to be used for a purpose. They would go away into captivity, but preserved all the while so that they might bring the Messiah into the world. But they needed to know that the same fate that befell Israel, so far as their destruction and being delivered over to the hand of the enemy, it was coming their direction as well, and for many of the same reasons. I hope this has been helpful. I hope you've enjoyed the thoughts that we've been given. If there's some time left, you may give some time to some discussion over the things that we've talked about. Thank you and have a great evening.